Hello everyone. So today I'm talking about error correction and the perfectibility of the bibliographic record. I better warn you, I have some very, very ugly MARC slides coming up, so please bear with me. So this is an overview of what I'll be talking about here on the screen. So essentially, when the theme for this year's conference was announced, it struck me immediately as having relevance to my own work. As a cataloguer, it's very easy to make mistakes, and the mistakes that we do make are visible for all to see, and while some may seem rather minor, the more serious errors can have a profound effect on resource discovery. So it seemed to me that it would be worth exploring some of those errors today, as well as thinking more broadly about what failure really means in the context of bibliographic data creation, and to ask, what is an error, and when is it worth creating? So I propose to examine the topic using the Legal Deposit Library Share Cataloguing program as a case study, and in doing so, detail some of the steps that we take to correct and validate the metadata that we create. So here's, as I say, I'll be talking about MARC, ISBD, authority control, and subject headings, essentially. So briefly, the Shared Cataloguing program itself is a joint effort by the Legal Deposit Libraries in Trinity in the UK to catalogue everything published in the UK and Ireland. In TCD, we're responsible for cataloguing everything published in Ireland, as well as all UK material beginning with the letters D, R, and S. Don't ask me why. We catalogue everything using established standards such as MARC 21, RDA, ISBD, LCSH, and all our records are submitted to the British National Bibliography once a week, and there they're published under a Creative Commons license. Since we're generating original metadata, obviously our work needs to be accurate and precise, so therefore we use the latest cutting-edge encoding schemas, or do we? Sorry, next slide. Oh, hang on. Going pear-shaped here. Do you have the clicker? Oh, here we are. So, MARC, this is my most horrific slide. You don't have to read this. MARC, as you know, has been around since the late 60s, complex and highly granular. It also is somewhat clunky and awkward to use. It's a complicated array of tags, fields, and indicators, originally designed to compress as much data as possible within a single record. It means that even experienced catalogers can go awry sometimes, and especially when it's used in conjunction with ISBD punctuation. So here's an example of a compressed MARC file. So that's really what we're dealing with, and that has not changed since the late 60s. Obviously, that's not the field we use to enter our data, but that is the legacy format that we're working with. So first, it's worth noting that some data elements in MARC are represented twice, and that could be regarded as redundant. The 008 field, for example, which provides coded information about the record as a whole, must mirror the data entered in the record proper. And this can be a rich source of confusion. In this example here, the dates conflict, but also the illustrations can conflict, the language can conflict. So as a cataloguer, you have to be really alert when you're recording the data. Similarly, the 300 field, where we record physical details, that has to have a corresponding 336 field, and it's very easy to forget this. In this example, the illustrations didn't have a matching 336. That might sound also quite arcane, but believe you me, it's very easy to miss these basic MARC elements. Every MARC field is preceded by indicators that, and it's impossible to remember what they all are because there's hundreds of them, so you're constantly looking to the MARC manual for help. The location and use of non-filing indicators, which are important for the correct indexing of titles, varies depending on the field, and in the case of the 240, which is the uniform title field, they're just simply not used at all, so you have to be very alert to this when you're creating the metadata. I have only one slide in punctuation, you'll be relieved to hear, because I think we'd all lose the will to live if I talked about this at any great length. But it's hard to get away from when you're talking about cataloguing, because bear in mind that MARC was originally designed to encode card catalogues, and that legacy lives on to some extent in how we use punctuation in the bibliographic data record. Elements are separated by commas, semicolons, colons, depending on what tag you're in. Some fields end in a period, some fields don't, depending on what field follows on. And for example, the field for physical description, the 300, never ends in any punctuation unless it's followed by a series statement. There's never any punctuation after round brackets, and the O2O field, where we record the ISBN, Long the Bain Assistance Programmers, now has a separate subfield to accommodate format statements. But this is not preceded by any punctuation, and I get this wrong all the time, and I find it really infuriating. But I'm not going to talk about punctuation anymore. I'm just going to move on briefly to the MARC report, because happily, to keep us on the straight and narrow, we have this incredible utility called MARC report. Once a week we compile all our records and we run a report, and this provides us a list of errors for correction. And as you can see, it can be customized with incredible detail, and it is an absolute godsend, I have to say. I just draw your attention to the section in the corner there. This refers to report blank spaces at end of field. This refers to a particularly infuriating error. If you leave any trailing spaces in a MARC record, it will be declared invalid by the BMB. So essentially, it's just a mistake that you cannot see, and it trips me up constantly. But thankfully, it's picked up by MARC report. And here's just a summary report. Pretty much half our records tend to have some kind of error, usually something fairly trivial, but it does catch the odds more serious error. So that's MARC report, and while it is incredibly useful as a mechanism for maintaining quality control, it is less helpful when it comes to the evaluation of authorized access points and subject headings. So once the corrections are made, a colleague will then review each record, paying particular attention to series headings and the use of controlled vocabularies. It's obviously very important that we identify individuals correctly, as a mistake would clearly have an impact on resource discovery. And all our headings have to be verified with the Library of Congress NACO file. And if there's a conflict or a new author, we have to submit an authority record. However, one can make mistakes, and here's an embarrassing example where I got the authorized heading wrong. Authors with double-barreled names are a particular minefield, because unless you check all the variations, you can very easily get the heading wrong. And here my colleague has spotted that I've made an error. Under RDA, we're obliged to include a lot more biographical data in our authority records, and this is both good and bad because you can tend to make more mistakes. So we include information about gender, about profession, and to my embarrassment, I've actually got the gender wrong. Here's an example of an authority record I made where I identified someone as male when they were actually female. Obviously, it's very important that we get these kind of details right, not alone for the data protection issues, but in terms of the author's information. And with regard to gender, it's interesting, RGA specifies that we record the gender which the author self-identifies with, but at the moment we can only choose male or female, and as colleagues in the US are arguing, in a non-binary world, I really do think we need more categories. And it's also worth remembering that any name that we change or update or add a date to, the corresponding bibliographic records in the catalogue have to be amended, and that's not something I think we've all failed to do, and the task of file maintenance is absolutely never-ending. I just wanted to show you one more example. For years, Eamon de Valera was recorded incorrectly in catalogues because the actual authorized heading was wrong. It was misspelt by Library of Congress, and it took a great deal of persuasion of one of my colleagues and a lot of correspondence to get them to correct it to the actual heading, Eamon Ifada, with no double N. He was misspelt, and it kind of begs the question, if someone as important as Dev can be incorrect, what other horrors lie within the catalogue more generally, you know? Just moving on from authority control, another problematic area for the cataloguer is the correct application. Actually, here's another example of LCSH. I'll just go back a little bit. Another problematic area for the cataloguer is the correct application of subject headings. And given that we're not subject specialists, these headings are generally arrived at from a perusal of the blurb, the contents note, and the consultation of works on a related topic. It takes time and effort to become familiar with LCSH's structure with its complex aggregation of differently coded subdivisions, which sometimes change order depending on the heading. It's inevitably a constant source of error. So apart from then, and in this, here's an example where I've just made a complete mistake. This is a book about the Picts, and I completely forgot to include any headings on Scotland, which would be an obvious thing to include. And this is where we see the benefit of peer review, having a colleague having a second glance at your record and picking up on mistakes. So apart from the inherent biases of the schema itself, it's a highly subjective process selecting the right headings. While the identification of named persons, places, and events is relatively straightforward, identifying the topical content, what something is actually about, is pretty tricky. I just want to show you another book. This is one I catalogued recently, an absolutely fascinating title, The Case of the Abbot of Drimna, a medieval Irish story of sex change. I was really stumped by this book about what subject headings to assign it. I kind of really didn't know where to start, and I thought it might be a good example to show today. Initially, I think I put in something generic like Sexuality Ireland, but it really wasn't appropriate because this was primarily, and it's a fantastic story by the way, this was primarily an allegorical tale, and a colleague suggested a much better heading here, Transsexuals in Literature, which captures the more literary nature of the work. So in this instance, we see an example of both the subtleness and richness of LCH, but also the difficulty in applying it. And while it may seem a little bit obscure, I just wanted to cite it as an example of the difficulty of pinning down the aboutness of a work. And while it's helpful to have a peer review process, since in addition to spotting basic errors, it allows for a second opinion. And it's also worth noting that LCSH is a bit inadequate with regard to concepts to do with Ireland. So sometimes we have to submit new terms. And here's just a sample of some of the headings we've had to create over the years. Everything from high crosses to Sheena the Gigs to the shamrock as an emblem. And that's an ongoing task for us as well. So that's pretty much it in terms of the shared cataloguing program. We submit all our records every Monday to the BNB. They in turn have their own matching procedures, and 1 or 2 records can be rejected, but usually for something fairly minor. But I want to move on for the last couple of minutes and talk more broadly about cataloguing. As we've seen, it's very easy to go off piste bibliographically. And it's fair to say that not all records go through such a detailed process of review and validation as I've outlined. And it could be argued that this focus on very detailed library-specific standards, in doing that, we lose sight of broader issues in resource discovery and fail our users in more fundamental ways. This was brought home to me a few years ago when RDA was introduced as a replacement for AACR2 as the default content standard for libraries. While we've always worked in a hybrid environment, certain retrospective changes were recommended to facilitate the new standard, specifically the removal of all abbreviations, and this had huge import for biblical headings, for example. So I undertook the task to update these, and I was kind of sorry I started in a way, because while it was easy enough to amend most, this is Job, by the way, a figure the catalogers identify with quite often. When I went in to amend the headings, I discovered so many errors and variations. It took me nearly 4 days to figure them all out. There were hundreds of errors. But essentially, all I was doing was transferring this to that. And by the time I got to the end of the process, I really did ask, in a world of keyword searching, would this make any difference to the user? And in this context, what is an error? And is it worth correcting? That's just one example, but I thought maybe it was illustrative of some of the kind of bigger issues that are out there in terms of library metadata. So I just wanted to show that the bibliographic record, in the sense of a catalogue as a whole, it's always a work in progress, and to demonstrate that some of the things that we perceive as mistakes or failures might not necessarily be regarded as so by our users. In the shared cataloging program, we endeavour to adhere to best practice, but it would be impossible to give all bibliographic data remediated within the library's discovery tool the same level of care and attention. And this is becoming more of an issue as we ingest metadata from sources which do not adhere to library-specific standards. And in this context, we might be more our attention might be more usefully directed towards engaging with other ontologies, linked data, and the world of the semantic web. Just to end on a quote, the philosopher Daniel Dennett once wrote, "The chief trick to making good mistakes is not to hide them, especially not from yourself." Hopefully I've stuck by that today. Failure in the library world is often associated with implementation of something new, but within the world of cataloging, it often emerges out of the application of something old schemas, old standards, old habits of thought. So no, while the library catalogue has never and will never be perfect, I think it's always useful to reflect on how perfected we want it to be. Thank you.